Hey everyone, James here from the Flying Guillotine Hong Kong Movie Reviews YouTube channel. Today going to be talking about the late 1960s Chang Cheh films. Recently saw a bunch of these for the first time. Of course, I'd seen some of the more well-known ones maybe 10 or 11 years ago when I was first getting into Hong Kong cinema, but wanted to just, because I am a big fan of Chang Cheh, and I think his work is just consistently very good. At the minimum, you're looking at something that's at least highly entertaining. It's flawed, and some of his films are really, really good and just all-time classics. So I have some favorites. I had originally been kind of seeing like the mid to late Chang Cheh films and kind of like the mid to late 70s, but wanted to go back just for completeness sakes and come back and watch some of these earlier films and just see the start of his career. And I'm really glad I did, because a lot of these films are really, really good, and I think extremely underrated. The way that we tend to kind of establish canons, unofficial canons in most cases, and the ones that are canonicalized, I think is the correct term, is that you only tend to have room for one or two films per filmmaker, or one or two films per era. And I feel like kind of the consensus has formed around, of course, the One-Armed Swordsman, which is a great film, starring Jimmy Wang Yu, just a seminal film that is incredibly influential, absolutely deserving. And so what happens, though, when these films are canonicalized is there can often be sort of these unsung gems that are just not even a significant drop-off, but almost just as worthy as the one that actually does get celebrated the most. And when it comes to a director like Chang Cheh, who has directed so many movies, I think that tendency is even more emphasized when it comes to someone like him, who in this brief period, just starting in 1966 to 69, he directed 10 martial arts films from this period. And, you know, you can look at the start of this period, which really started with Come Drink With Me, done by King Hu, and sort of inspiring that movement. And King Hu, for the rest of his career, who was a younger man than Chang Cheh, by the way, directed something like 10 movies. And Chang Cheh, in just this 4-year span, knocks off 10 films. So I think one thing, just piggybacking off that too, is just it's fun to see his craft grow during this time. And I think even in just a 1-year span, from going from Magnificent Trio and Tiger Boy, which is sadly a lost film, to 1967's output of One-Armed Swordsman, The Assassin, and Trail of the Broken Blade, you can see an immense amount of growth in Chang Cheh as a director, and you just feel like by the end of the decade, he really knows what he is doing as far as directing a movie. And so, as well as just Shaw Brothers as a whole, as a studio, this is very on in their career. And so I think one thing that is kind of interesting in that sense, too, is the Japanese influence on Hong Kong cinema. Hong Kong cinema, and as kind of like the big popular entity, really kind of took off. This is sort of like the start period of when Shaw Brothers really started to hit, and those films eventually got to be extremely popular. And this is really when they are starting. And where are they drawing from? Well, it's drawn from a lot of places. Maybe most obvious to Western audiences are the Westerns that it's drawing from, and those are pretty obvious. But another one that I think is probably more prevalent than American Westerns or spaghetti Westerns on it is the Japanese influence on this. And supposedly, I have read that Shaw Brothers encouraged the filmmakers to really study Akira Kurosawa, of course, but also Hideo Gosha. And I think that's very, very obvious in, of course, The Magnificent Trio, which is one of the 1966 martial arts films that Chang Cheh did, which is more or less just a direct remake from Gosha's Three Outlaw Samurai, which is a really good samurai film you should check out. I think it's actually better than Magnificent Trio. But you can also see just Gosha's influence, I think, in a lot of the other ones, and including, one thing that you'll see in a lot of these samurai films of the 60s too, is this kind of like concluding, just totally exhausting all against one fights. You have that version of it in these Hong Kong films too. It plays out differently. I'm personally glad that we have both. I'm totally happy to have those influences in here. I think all those films are great, but you especially have that sort of like exhausting fight in Have Sword Will Travel especially, and even that frenetic pace in something like Invincible Fist. So a lot of really good films that kind of came out of that just exhausting tradition of one against many, or in some cases, because this is Chang Cheh and brotherhood is a huge theme of it, two against many. Another thing you'll see in some of these films too, I feel like, is the Ronin influence. And you could argue this is maybe the Western influence as well. So the lone gunman trope, the Ronin, or maybe double Ronin in some of these cases. Ronin, for those not familiar, is a Japanese masterless samurai. It's often sort of the starting plot point for a lot of the Japanese films, having this basically highly skilled warrior that is often impoverished but sort of detached from society and free from a master. And I think you really see that trope very obviously in something like The Assassin, Have Sword Will Travel with David Chang's character and stuff like that. And I think these things continue to exist in these films, but seeing it just really early on, I think really crystallizes in my mind sort of these ideas that are coming into the film. So I think these Chang Cheh films, all of them, are pretty much worth watching. I think they're all quite good. Another thing that does tend to concern me was when you're getting into sort of the early works of the genre. For me, this rings true for especially like 1960s Poliziotteschi and Jolly. Things that happened before sort of the heyday, or the genre really knew what it was doing and had sort of perfected the edge to them, is that they lack, I don't know, there's something missing from them. I don't think that's true of these films at all. I think these films are absolutely ready to be viewed and hold up 100% today. I think Chang Cheh, even though the blood splashes may not be as voluminous as they would be later in his career, these films are very violent, have really high body counts, and very much do feel like Chang Cheh films. So I do, if you're a fan of martial arts films, Shaw Brothers films, highly recommend people do check out these Chang Cheh films. Gonna be concluding, just kind of talking through a few of them, and finishing up with the top four. Here's kind of an idea of the way that his career went during this time. 1966, directed Magnificent Trio, the remake of Three Outlaw Samurai, and Tiger Boy, a lost film, starring Jimmy Wang Yu. Another cool thing about these films is so many of those stars that we continue to love are in these early films, from Wang Yu, David Chang, Tai Lung, and Lo Lia, all of them in a lot of these films. Magnificent Trio has Wang Yu and Lo Lia in two of the heroic samurai films. 1967, I feel like this is the year he really starts to hit his stride. He, of course, directed the One-Armed Swordsman in this year, The Assassin, and Trail of the Broken Blade. I think all three of these are quite good. The following year, he directed the sequel to Come Drink With Me, Golden Swallow, film I don't quite love. I am due for a rewatch of it, but, it is what it is. In 1969, he finally became fully prolific, directing 5 martial arts films in this year: Return of the One-Armed Swordsman, Flying Dagger, Invincible's Fist, Have Sword Will Travel, and Dead End. Alright, so here are kind of my tiers for these films. The films that for me just don't quite work or don't quite get there, but are still well worth watching, are The Magnificent Trio. For me, it just kind of is forever in the shadow of Gosha's Three Outlaw Samurai. I just don't think it's as good as a film. I don't think Chang Cheh is quite developed. It's the one film where I do feel like he is a little bit just not quite there, but you can certainly see glimpses of it. Golden Swallow, which is the Come Drink With Me sequel. Again, it's been a long time since I've seen this film. I'm not sure why it didn't work with me the first time, but yeah. It's interesting mostly for a high contrast with Come Drink With Me. Come Drink With Me is a film that I did rewatch recently, and I think it's great, but I also was a little bit slower to come to it. And Dead End, for me, it's just a little bit too weird to see Chang Cheh in the contemporary setting, and I just couldn't quite get into it this time around. Interesting film. I know a lot of people do like it, so I would recommend people check it out, but just does not quite get there for me. And then, so on to the next category of films that I do like quite a bit, and I think are generally quite solid. Invincible Fist, Trail of the Broken Blade, and Return of the One-Armed Swordsman. Invincible's Fist is the one I want to talk about the most. This is the one I've seen the most recently, and it's notable for both having Lo Lia and David Chang, but it has this incredible frenetic energy to it that's very, very it just feels unhinged in the best way possible. And one thing I do like about these films is they're not all choreographed in the same way. They'll often have different styles to the way they choreograph a different film. And this film feels very raw, very violent, and very kind of off the cuff. So that's one thing I really did like about it. For me, it's very close to this top four, actually. And okay, so this top four, one thing I like about these films is they're all quite different from one another. They all are unique. One-Armed Swordsman is very different from The Assassin, even though they're both Jimmy Wang Yu films. For instance, The Assassin, he has both arms. But they're just very different films altogether. Have Sword Will Travel has a lot of that Ronin Japanese influence to it, kind of talking about like different familial ties. Anyways, here's the list. One-Armed Swordsman, The Assassin, Have Sword Will Travel, and Flying Dagger. They're in no particular order. I think they're all definitely worth checking out. And personally, if I were making a Chang Cheh canon, I'd put all four of these films in it. One-Armed Swordsman is the most kind of maybe representative of kind of that Chang Cheh revenge story, and perhaps the most familiar and typical. For that reason, I think it's a very deserving film. I think it's a film that really establishes Jimmy Wang Yu as a great star. I think there's a reason why a lot of people put it as number one on his films. I think it's absolutely deserving. I just think these other films are too. The Assassin, which I talked about and filmed a separate review on, is just a very rich film that has goes into a lot more depth than you are used to seeing. In some ways, it kind of has that very traditional revenge film, such as One-Armed Swordsman, but it plays out in about 35 minutes. So it's interesting to see where it goes from there. There's a little bit more melodrama in it. I do think it's a little bit more ambitious than average, but it has some amazing one against many fights at the end, and it is also extremely violent both at the beginning and the end. So I think a really, really good movie too. Have Sword Will Travel, just talked about a little bit. You get to see the pairing that Chang Cheh would use a lot through the 70s, Tai Lung, David Chang, both really good here. Another great finale. This one, they kind of travel up I don't know if it's a temple, but it's like this big, tall building, and they're going up each level, having to kill more and more people. In that sense, I don't know, it has definitely more of a contemporary Japanese film feel to it as a result for me. It also has the great Ku Feng, who played a lot of villains in here too, just hamming it up in the best possible way as well. And Flying Dagger, Last of All, this is the part where they couldn't quite figure out if Lo Le should be villains or heroes, and Flying Dagger plays into that most wonderfully. I think Lo Le, you could certainly make the case that he's the best actor, best big actor, kind of appearing in these films. He kind of just has this like dark, brooding presence to him. And Flying Dagger, very good movie. Put it right up there with those other four. Okay, so let me know what your favorite of the 1960s Chang Cheh films are. If you agree or disagree with anything I said, I'd be very curious to hear. Thank you for tuning in. I will see you next time.